It's July 16th, 1945. We're in Berlin, where British Prime Minister Winston Churchill is surveying what's left of the former Nazi capital. The day is oppressively hot. Churchill, far from the indomitable lion he's often depicted as, is actually struggling in the heat. The exhaustion of the last few years had taken its toll. At almost 71, he's not that old, but high blood pressure and bowel problems have weakened him. He looks substantially older. But still, he just has to be there. He has to see where Adolf Hitler, the man Churchill called a monster of wickedness, the man who Churchill wanted to send straight to the electric chair without trial, spent his final, miserable days. As the car pulls up at the shattered skeleton of the Reich Chancellory, Churchill's not alone. With him is his daughter Mary and his Foreign Secretary, Anthony Eden. The party are guided by a group of Russian officers, eager to make sure the visit goes off without a hitch. There's a crowd too. Berliners have come out to meet them, as Churchill himself says. Except for one old man who shook his head disapprovingly, they all began to cheer. My hate had died with their surrender, and I was much moved by their demonstrations, and also by their haggard looks and threadbare clothes. Inside the Chancellory, Churchill encounters a scene of total devastation. As his daughter grips his arm, he sees what those last desperate days of fighting have done to the place. Finally, leaning on his gold-capped cane and moving unsteadily through the rubble, Churchill makes his way into the Chancellory's winter garden. Sweat beads on his brow. It stains his lightweight military uniform, but he presses on. Led by the Russian guides, he steps through the low doorway into the blockhouse in the winter garden, and from here he begins his walk down the staircase and into the bowels of the Fuhrer bunker, to confront the place where his former adversary met with his final, definitive defeat. But first, a quick word from our sponsor. See, although this year will be 80 years since the end of World War II, what many might not have noticed is that it's also 250 years since the United States Navy was founded, a service that was instrumental in ending the Second World War. As a result, World of Warships is celebrating this anniversary with an event that lets you command those very ships yourself. World of Warships is free to play on PC, and a game where you take the helm of legendary vessels, battleships, destroyers, cruisers, even aircraft carriers, and fight across stunningly realistic seas, complete with dynamic weather and over 40 maps. Right now, you can build your own base in the limited time Liberty Harbor event, unlocking rewards and US Navy history as you go. And new players get a massive boost when they sign up with the code STEPUP250, including an American Tier 3 cruiser St. Louis, 20 days of premium time, and a commander to lead your fleet. So, whether you're a history buff, a strategist, or just love naval battles, it's the perfect time to set sail. Click the link in the description, use the code STEPUP250, and join millions of captains celebrating 250 years of naval power. Thank you to World of Warships for sponsoring this video, and thank you, the viewer, for not skipping the ad. And now, let's get back to Hitler's bunker. The Reich Chancellory was very much Hitler's building. The old chancellery of the days of Bismarck had been a great Rococo structure and was once the palace of counts and princes. But Hitler despised it. In the Fuhrer's own estimation, it was only, quote, fit for a soap company. In search of something more suitable for the new Reich, he commissioned Albert Speer to build a new one in 1938. But the grandeur of the new structure didn't last that long, because 7 years later, as Soviet forces closed in on central Berlin in April 1945, the new chancellery was a target. It was both the symbolic centre of Nazism, and it was the physical stronghold of the regime. So, predictably, the Soviets battered it. But even once the Soviet troops were inside the walls, and even after the shells and bombs had stopped falling, the Reich Chancellory remained a battlefield. As late as May 1st, a ragtag collection of SS personnel from across Europe put up a pretty dogged resistance. In the Chancellory's halls and corridors, Latvian and Spanish SS groups fought alongside Romanian volunteers and the French soldiers of the SS Charlemagne division. They held out for longer than expected too, as bullets and grenades tore the lower floors of the Chancellery to pieces. When diplomat Andrei Gromyko visited the building after its fall, he noted that the lowest floors of the Reich Chancellory represented chaos. Obviously, the garrison of the citadel fiercely resisted here. All around lie heaps of crossbeams and overhead covers, both metal and wood, and huge pieces of ferro concrete. A grim and distressing impression. It was, Gromyko added, a proper illustration to Dante's hell. Just select which circle. The Chancellery itself was designed to be imposing and impressive. It was more than 20 metres tall and 400 metres long. But beneath the surface, it held a secret that remained hidden from view until the very last hours of the war in Europe. This was the Fuhrer bunker. The bunker that was supposed to be the new Reich Chancellory's air raid shelter. But the situation in Berlin had grown so dire by January 1945 that it became a home to Hitler and many of his high command. There were, in fact, two bunkers. There was the upper Vorbunker, or pre-bunker, which was largely for the support staff. This would have housed between 20 and 40 people, including nurses, secretaries, and kitchen staff. This was located in a basement, roughly 6 metres beneath the Winter Garden at the Chancellery. 2.5 metres below that, and several metres to the southwest, was the Fuhrer bunker. A stairway connected the two levels, though this could be completely sealed off by a steel bulkhead if the situation called for it. Directly above the Fuhrer bunker was around 3.5 metres of reinforced concrete. This was designed to resist even a direct hit from a bomb or a shell. The concrete barrier protected the bunker so well that the complex became very hard to demolish even after the war was over. Inside the Fuhrer bunker was, of course, Hitler's own quarters. He had a bedroom down here as well as a private study. Other high-ranking Nazis, plus Hitler's mistress Eva Braun, had their own private quarters. There was also a kitchen area and a dining room, as well as all the map rooms, conference rooms, and communications rooms necessary to remain in command, even when underground. All of this, of course, sounds like a fortress in some kind of post-apocalyptic hellscape. And I suppose by the end, it kind of was. Attempts were made to make it comfortable and at least a little homely. Artworks were taken from the Reich Chancellory and hung in the bunker, including an ostentatious painting of Frederick the Great, the 18th century Prussian king. Hitler loved Frederick the Great, even though the Fuhrer hated the martial Prussian aristocracy that characterised the German military for more than a century after his death. For Hitler, though, Frederick was a military genius and an expansionist who believed in growing Germanic territory. It didn't matter that Frederick tolerated religious freedom, including freedom for Jews, and so would have been appalled by the final solution. It also didn't matter that Frederick was very likely homosexual, which would have got him sent to the concentration camps in the days of the Third Reich. As well as this garish portrait of a man that he didn't really understand, Hitler also decked out the Fuhrer bunker with opulent rugs and chandeliers. He was going to stick it out to the end, just like the rest of the Berliners, only most Berliners didn't have a chandelier. But for all the Nazis' attempts to brighten up the complex, the bunker was, all in all, a pretty grim place to reside. Berlin's high water table meant that it was constantly damp and susceptible to flooding. To counteract this, pumps were installed, running around the clock to keep the place free from water. Adding to this, the bunker needed constant ventilation and an air purification system, and it also needed to be self-sustaining. It would still be the nerve centre of the Reich, even if or when all else had fallen, so it needed generators to keep all this machinery running. Clanking, oily generators. This meant that dozens of people were packed into a noisy and wet environment, only 278 metres square. It would have been claustrophobic and deeply unpleasant, even if you were able to forget about the incoming Red Army. And the congestion would have increased over time as the Soviets drew nearer. As it became clear that they were entering the final days, the Fuhrer bunker ceased to be a military installation and became something resembling a kind of refugee camp. Goebbels moved his wife and their 6 children into the bunker in April, and Eva Braun also permanently the same month. The pioneering aviator Hannah Reich also moved in. Reich's boundary-breaking achievement of being the first woman to fly a helicopter was certainly impressive, but her reputation is tarnished somewhat by her association with Hitler. In fact, she was one of the last people to ever see the Fuhrer alive. Among the other people with the Fuhrer in those final days were the numerous generals and military personnel who came and went from the bunker. As they attempted to mastermind the increasingly futile defence of the capital, they added to the overcrowded, anxious feeling within the complex. So, grim conditions, decaying opulence, and lots of noise and lots of people. This was the life in the Fuhrer bunker in those final days. It's also worth remembering who these people were. As the chief propagandist, Joseph Goebbels was one of the key driving forces behind the Aryan myth and the poisonous Nazi fantasy. But even if you agreed with his politics, his personality made him a pretty difficult person to be around. Peter Longrich's biography paints Goebbels as an extreme narcissist who was constantly desperate for recognition. He was also fractious and irritable and argued with everyone, which is bad at the best of times, but even worse if you're trapped in a bunker together. Chancellery Chief and Hitler's personal secretary, Martin Bormann, was another insufferable individual. His hyperactive work rate and obsession with micromanagement made him unpopular even amongst other Nazis. But in those final days, the stress of the situation really got to him. He took to drink, raiding the Chancellery's wine cellar and boozing himself to oblivion. Writer B.P. Perry has described Bormann as a notorious womanizer who, quote, found plenty of takers in the increasingly cavalier atmosphere that took hold as the Soviets closed in. But rather than being a kind of bacchanalian party animal, the truth is likely to be rather more sordid. The fact of the matter is, for people around him, the only thing worse than a sober Bormann was a drunk one, especially if you were a woman. Then, of course, there was Hitler himself. Losing grip on reality, Hitler was prone to rages and lashing out at anyone he felt he could blame for his situation. He'd always been a nightmare to work for. Even on the day of the Normandy landings, Hitler's aides waited 6 hours to inform the Fuhrer simply because they were terrified of disturbing his morning's rest. Now he was even worse. Beset by Parkinson's disease, Hitler was ravaged by severe tremors. This made him angry and frustrated and contributed to his violent mood swings. Hitler's bodyguard, Rochus Misch, said that the Fuhrer might spend long periods quiet and contemplative in the bunker, but when he exploded, he really popped. Bruno Ganz's award-winning portrayal of the deteriorating Fuhrer in the film Downfall is believed to be highly accurate. Ganz meticulously researched his role, and so he was able to nail all of the Fuhrer's deranged mannerisms. The scene in which Hitler rages against his generals is now famous and often parodied. But in fact, this event did take place on April 22nd, 1945. After learning that General Felix Steiner had not carried out his counterattack as ordered, Hitler went into a full meltdown. His mental and physical health collapsed, and it was, really, the beginning of the end. So, life in the bunker would have been hell, but even the worst torments can't last forever. Sometime after 2:30 p.m. on April 30th, Adolf Hitler and his newlywed bride Eva killed themselves. Eva took cyanide, while Hitler shot himself in the head. We'll do a future video on the suicide of Adolf Hitler, as this is something that needs to be explored in greater depth. But for now, with their Fuhrer gone, let's turn to Joseph and Magda Goebbels, who killed themselves in the Chancellery Garden the following day, but not before murdering their 6 young children. The regime was now toppling. Those remaining in the bunker now had a choice. They could either flee, or they could take their own lives. Bormann chose the former. He made a run for it at 11 p.m. on May 1st, along with several others. Eager to avoid capture by the Soviets, the group attempted to cross the Spree River at the Weidendamme Bridge to the west when they were struck by a glancing blow from an anti-tank round. It's probable that Bormann was injured by this explosion. He pressed on with the group, but they split up soon after. A little later, Hitler Youth Commander Arthur Axmann reported seeing Bormann's body on a bridge near a rail yard. The body was never found by the Allies, and the true nature of Bormann's fate remains more or less unknown. Back at the bunker, Generals Hans Krebs and Wilhelm Burgdorf both hung on until the very last minute. As the sun rose over Berlin on May the 2nd, the two generals would have heard the Soviets getting closer. They would have known it was all finished. And so, when the Soviets finally broke in, just after 9 a.m. on May the 2nd, the two generals followed their Fuhrer into death. Gunshots to the head were their method of choice. There was someone else who hung around until the end too. This was Johannes Henschel, the chief mechanic. When presented with the choice of fleeing or dying, he chose neither. He just stayed put and did nothing. And to be fair, he had to. There was a field hospital in the Chancellery above his head. Someone had to keep the lights on and the power flowing. He gave himself up to the Soviets and spent the best part of the next 4 years in jail. For the next 2 months, Soviet forces were alone in Berlin. Other Allied troops didn't arrive until July 4th, 1945, and Soviet authorities repeatedly barred access to the Chancellery and to the Fuhrer bunker beneath. Churchill wouldn't make his famous Iron Curtain speech until March of the following year, but already the latent Cold War was starting. This made the Soviets secretive over the contents of the Chancellery and the bunker. They wouldn't permit British or American officials to enter either building. Meanwhile, the bunker fell into disrepair. To give engineer Henschel his due, he'd done his job right to the last. When the Soviets burst in, all that ventilation and pumping equipment was working just fine. But when the Soviets turned it off, the environment began to deteriorate. Damp gradually rotted the furnishings, while repeated floods turned an already miserable place into a fetid hellhole. Upstairs, of course, the Soviets had ransacked the Chancellery, searching for anything that might be useful to them as they shored up their position ahead of the Potsdam Conference to be held on July 17th. The day before the conference, on July 16th, Churchill and US President Harry Truman toured the fallen city, and they would have been allowed to visit the Chancellery under Soviet supervision. President Truman had only been in office for a few months after Franklin Roosevelt's death from a stroke on April 12th. This may have influenced his outlook upon visiting Berlin. Truman hadn't even been in Roosevelt's cabinet until 1945. After the removal of the controversial Henry Wallace as vice president in January, Roosevelt needed a compromise candidate to replace him. Truman was effectively everybody's pal and was the ideal choice as VP, but he knew almost nothing about the secret machinations at the heart of the government and the war effort. He didn't even know about the development of the atomic bomb until Roosevelt died, which is ironic because Truman has become synonymous with the bombing of Japan. The war in Europe had never really been Truman's war. It was the war of his predecessor, and what's more, he still had 1.8 million ground troops deployed in the Pacific and had just lost more than 12,000 men on Okinawa. Truman wasn't there for a holiday either. He was a staunch opponent of communism. It was his Truman Doctrine 2 years later in 1947 that would lay the groundworks for decades of American intervention in the 20th century. Truman was there to deal with Stalin and to begin shaping the post-war future according to American interests. So, the president remained largely in his car during the tour, looking at the ruins of various Berlin landmarks as they were pointed out to him. But this was Churchill's war. Churchill's political career was largely finished by the 1930s, and it was only the outbreak of the war that thrust him back into the spotlight. He was only the Prime Minister because Neville Chamberlain's policy of appeasement had failed. For Churchill, there was a personal aspect to the struggle, and now he wanted to see how it had all ended. He wanted to, as much as was possible, look his former adversary Hitler in the face. Touring the city, Churchill took in the destruction he found, and in his own words, he said, "The city was nothing but a chaos of ruins. No notice had been given of our visit, and the streets had only ordinary passers-by." In the square, in front of the Chancellery, there was, however, a considerable crowd. Arriving at the Chancellery, the Prime Minister was met with cheers, but inside the building was in disarray. As the journalist Ronald McKee remembered, Mr. Churchill climbed over heaps of rubble and rubbish, poked into rooms, and wandered around the huge banquet hall, where 2 huge silver chandeliers had fallen to the floor. The smell of his cigar was strong and clean in the long, ornate reception hall, where Hitler once strode and where field marshals once hiled. They toured Hitler's office, but found it carpeted a foot deep in the dead Fuhrer's paper, since his desk had been overturned. But Churchill wanted to go further. He wanted to see the complex where Hitler himself had died. The delegation was led outside the Winter Garden, and down they went into the bunker. The smell was overpowering as the dank, fetid walls hung with slime. The aging PM was unsteady on his feet at the best of times, but the slippery, wet steps made progress impossible. He stood there in the Vorbunker, surveyed the scene, and returned to the surface. Churchill's biographer, Barbara Leeming, describes a forlorn figure. When at last he reached the top of the stairs and passed through the door of a concrete blockhouse into the daylight, his hulking frame appeared so shaky and depleted that a Russian soldier guarding the entrance reached out a hand to steady him. Once back in the garden, the Russian guides eagerly showed him a shell hole with 2 shallow graves dug within it. Besides the graves were 2 rusted petrol cans. The energetic Russians said this was where Adolf and Eva Hitler had been incinerated and burned. The aging statesman seemed to recoil at this, as Leeming tells us, Churchill paused briefly before turning away in disgust. It was all too much for Churchill. As the heat took its toll, he rested upon a chair beside a wall torn with bullet holes. The Russians were amused by this and informed him that the chair had once been Hitler's. According to Leaming, the visit was not a triumph for the Prime Minister. He looked visibly uncomfortable throughout, his eyes darting reportedly back to the doorway at the entrance to the bunker. When Mary Churchill finally emerged, the Prime Minister was in a hurry to leave the site. Mary would later share her thoughts with her mother. We gazed on the ruins of the Chancellory and saw the disordered air raid shelters where Hitler is said to have died. The tour was badly organised, but worth it. Churchill seems to have been badly shaken by his visit to the bunker. Perhaps he felt frustrated that his advancing years and failing health didn't permit him the last victory of venturing down into the depths. More likely, he had realised the truth that there was little to be gained in revelling in glories or standing over the graves of dead enemies. Instead, like Truman, he must now look to the future. A day later, the Potsdam Conference would begin and plans would be made for the geopolitical world of tomorrow. With this in mind, and with his daughter and his foreign secretary by his side, Churchill returned to the car waiting in the street.